Hey, folks, welcome to the Everyday Millionaire Mindset Matters podcast. Stephanie.
Hey, hon.
So, as always, a great topic today that we want to talk about. And how do I want to lead into this? We often have conversations like this that we're going to have today, but the realization that there is nothing new out there. I mean, we follow a lot of really great people. We do a lot of research. We unpack things. We coach things. And certainly we have our own, I guess, I don't want to call it narrative, but we have our own methodology and ways of helping people to unlock and be their best selves. And we have a context for living that we throw out in the shift program. And we talk about self discovery and being your best self and living your greatest life. But having said all of that, I don't know that we can own any of it. And this particular topic today really shines a light on. We love to unpack things, lift the hood. Those are a couple of phrases we often use. And today is no exception to that. So, topic today: 5 keys to unlocking your best self. What do you think?
Well, this one's really interesting because you and I discovered this sort of at the same time, and we were talking about, what could be our next podcast and how do we inspire people? And, nothing's really original, nothing's really new. And we both bumped into Dr. Benjamin Hardy around the same time. And to your point, there's nothing original out there, but I think what's really important, and if you're listening to this as, Mindset Matters, podcast listeners, is that our commitment is to distill a lot of this information and direct you and redirect you into areas that you can do your own discovery, your own uncovery, your own research.
Mm,
But let us do take my 40 years of personal development and growth and run with it. You don't
mhm.
have to do it all by yourself for the first time. And I think that's what I really discovered. And when we were both doing this Benjamin Hardy thing at the same time, it just cracked me up.
Well, it's interesting about Benjamin Hardy. I started following him many years ago when he was still just being a blogger and writing a few articles. And of course, now he's a best-selling author. He's a PhD, and he really is gone on to do some amazing stuff. His book, The Gap and the Gain, we've talked about it many times. I encourage people to read it and actually live it and take some of the strategies, tactics from it and apply them in our day-to-day life or in your late day-to-day life. You and I have shared many times that when we're breaking bread with chosen family or friends, we are often saying before we break bread, so let's go around the table once. What was your win of the day? What was your gain of the day or the week? Share some insights into the gain instead of looking at the gap, because it's very easy to fall into the trap of only looking at what you haven't accomplished and totally negating and minimizing and totally negating what you have gained. And you and I, in spite of all of the, I guess, the work, the reading, how aware we are, can still fall into that. I know I'm more guilty than you are at looking at the gap rather than the gain, but it certainly is something that shows up. So I don't think there could be enough reminders. We fold it into our life in a really powerful way, but it still shows up. So having said all of that, this isn't about Benjamin Hardy. This just happened to be a topic he brought up. And it was brought up, when we think about, and we've talked about many times, Brene Brown. So Brene Brown uses a quote that rather than try to be right, it's better to try and get it right. And her quote is actually pretty profound when you think about it. And we've had the conversation many times about those individuals with the need to be right. What do you call them?
I call them the right fighters.
The right fighters.
You gotta fight to be right.
And it's really, there's a lot of people that have that quality where they just need to be right. And if you're one of those people, maybe you want to listen closely to this particular episode. And so I think it is really foundational for our personal growth to be aware of, are we being a right fighter? Because,
Wait, slow down, cowboy. Let's not step over that. I just had a brainwave.
okay.
You think about being a right fighter. It means that you're demanding not just for yourself to be heard, but for other people to agree with the fact that you're right.
Of course.
And I think that's where the disconnect comes. And of course, as we've seen over the last 3.5, 4 years, is that need to be right is what creates a lot of this polarity. And
Oh, huge.
right. So the right fighting
Hmm.
also shuts down your ability to hear, not just listen, but to hear an opposing opinion or something
Yeah.
else that could actually matter to you. So the question I
Mhm.
always ask myself when I'm thinking about, am I being a right fighter or am I so committed to what I believe is right? And I've disciplined myself to ask myself, but what if I'm wrong?
Mhm.
But what if I'm wrong? Anyway, let's carry on. I just didn't want to step over that.
But with that question of what if I'm wrong, but that's the willingness to consider that you may not be right. And right fighters generally don't do that. So this
Well,
conversation
they
or part of
can't.
this conversation,
They can't because it would their brains would blow up. It would destroy their commitment to needing to be right. I've watched relationships be destroyed because somebody can't be
100%.
wrong.
Yeah, yeah,
That's all.
yeah. So it's a good foundation for this conversation because actually, to begin a journey or continue on a journey of some kind of self improvement or personal growth, we, in this conversation, to your point, have to let go of our attachment to have those really strong, rigid beliefs. And we have to be open to the possibility and have consideration of changing those and that that we might be wrong. So let's kick it off. This is back to what the original idea was: is 5 keys, And so first and foremost, we have to recognize, and again, we've had these conversations many times. So I kind of like the way that this is coming to fruition in terms of a conversation. The one story is your life is a story. So your life is just a story. We all have lived our life through the narrative that we've constructed in our minds. And that's what it is. It is our story. It shapes our identity and it actually influences how we perceive the world. Stephen Covey, he stated once, and this is so good: we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And that leads into my favorite quote, which is by Wayne Dyer, which says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So the point is that our own self-image and the beliefs that frame our narrative for our story, we have to stop and acknowledge that it is neither perfect or entirely accurate. And it's probably just not the truth because we're looking at it through a different set of filters. So, in other words, who we are today and how we see the world today filters the story from the past. And we're looking at the world through a different lens. So I know that was saying a lot. Would you want to jump in here?
Well, briefly, just in the fact that our story is actually not real. Our memories are designed for self-preservation. So when
Mm,
we're looking back at our story, we're usually the hero or maybe the victim, rarely the villain in our own stories. But
mm,
if we think about our stories, and the line I use with my clients is, you are not your story. Your
mm,
story has got you here, but if you redefine and recontextualize how you look at your story, what if you go from being a victim to being the hero in your own story? Or unfortunately, many people demand the fact that they become the hero regardless of who they hurt, what they've done, the destruction along the way, but they have to be the hero. So a story always, in a story arc, one of my favorite people and one of my clients for a long time, Margaret, has always said there's a story arc where we get to the point where we fall in love with the hero and we, are all against and vilify the victim, or the villain, sorry. And what happens is that there's going to be a place where we have to find our way and define ourselves through our story. And if we're
mm.
always looking back and trying to define ourselves through our story, through our his story or our her story, then we really get stuck in how do we recreate or manifest our future and our what's next, because our history, is truly just the past. And as my Italian friend says, the pasta is the pasta.
That's so bad. Okay,
I
so I
know.
really like that his story, history, his
Thank
story,
you.
and it is just a story. And we sometimes hold it as an absolute truth. And, I've shared in the past that my dad and I had a pretty rocky relationship, as you know. And, I sometimes blame my dad and have in the past blamed my dad for a lot of things. But one time, and as you recall, I went to 3 sisters and I went to each of those sisters and I kind of, poked and delved and kind of unpacked and had conversations about dad. Their story about dad was so different than the story I was telling myself. Like I saying, 180 degrees from where I was at. So that was my first realization of, holy cow, I've got this whole story. Now, my experience was my experience. And, since then, of course, I look at all the gifts my dad gave me, regardless of how he showed up in my life as, the only boy or the only man in the family. But that's not really what this is about. The point is that it was a story I was telling myself. And as I've changed that story, I have a lot more empathy and compassion for my dad. And, that's just the way that went. It was just a story. So
And
that's
ultimately,
where.
empathy and compassion for yourself, because
Mhm,
me and Aaron and the kids and the grandkids and our chosen family and Michael and everybody that are benefiting from your Fredisms, from the fact that
mhm,
you
mhm,
learned so many things. I'm
true.
benefiting from it.
Yeah. That's very true. There's no doubt about it. And but back to what you originally said, I was definitely the victim of my story in those days where everything was, dad's fault. So, anyways, let's carry on. Number 2. Oh, this is so cool because it just kind of plays perfectly into what we were talking about, which is the past does not define you. It does not define us. And this is so important. Many I think, and as we've worked and we work with shift clients or clients in general, we find that many perceive the past as the determiner of their present, and that's for them, or whether it be for themselves or the events that shape them. And we often believe that or understand someone's past explains their present behavior. However, when they look at the research, it suggests a kind of a more liberating truth. And this is so good. And this is what Joe Dispenza talks about quite a lot, which is your present shapes the meaning of your past. The present shapes the meaning of your past. So when you recall a memory, your brain reconstructs it from your kind of current perspective. And that's what I said earlier, which is, but the filters that we look at the past through are different today than they were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, probably even 10 days ago. So I think when we can have that realization, you start to realize you can reframe and recreate your past. And I know that some of the work that you do with your clients and especially your athletes, and while we start to understand that our past has been pretty essential, uh, it's really the present that is shaping the meaning of our past. So for us to grow and evolve, we have to become a little more flexible in our thought processes and be willing to kind of reevaluate my past or your past, which I did when I had that whole story around my dad where I was such a victim, bad
But
dad.
what's super cool about what you just said is that if you wanna know what your thought processes are and what your mindset is, look
Hmm.
at where you are today.
Hmm.
Look at where you are today. This is the reconstruction and the construction of everything that you've done to get here. If you don't like it, then you have the opportunity to shift it and move it forward today.
Right now,
But most
that's all you got.
right now, because
Hmm.
what's curious to me is that if we don't like where we're at, and we don't see that we have the power to change it or to shift it or to at least reconfigure and recontextualize ourselves going forward, because we have to identify with who we are in the past, then we're surprised that we're not abundant or we're not living the life we want or we don't have the house we want or the relationship we want. It's because we're living in the past and we continually empower that past and make it true. So if you
Hmm.
don't like where you are today, check your story,
Hmm.
because you may be more committed to your story. You may be more committed to your story than you are to a compelling and beautiful future for yourself.
That statement right there, you may be more committed to your story. And this is something that is interesting when we're working with our own coaching clients, is that we often say we don't want your story. They automatically go to the story. We go, no, we don't care about your story, it doesn't matter. And sometimes it does, so I don't want to minimize that, but sometimes, no, we don't need the story. We're working with you today, so let's work from here forward. Let's not really have some whole conversation about what the past was. Sometimes it's necessary, but rarely, I think. What's your thoughts on that?
For me, rarely. I've had some pretty big conversations with people and clients that and this is no disrespect to my industry or to the work that people do, but many modalities in the performance coaching and the psychology world is about uncovering and discovering and bringing up all the stuff and the why you're like this and why you don't have everything you want and why you're in so much pain. And again, I don't want that to come across minimizing, but the truth is there's no more why. If you
Mhm.
really are committed to choosing and creating a different trajectory for your life, the why no longer matters. And the
Mhm.
why becomes the barrier to you moving forward. If you need to keep discovering the why, and you've got a psychologist or a counselor or somebody that's going to keep getting paid every time you come to a session. And I have a friend that has spent $175 per hour over the last 25 years
Mhm.
to talk about why I'm like this. And I go, yeah,
Mhm.
but you're totally perfect the way you are. Why can't we just look forward and create what's next? But I need to know why. I'm like, what if you don't?
Right. Well,
What
I
if you
think
don't?
there's another side of that, which is what I got to many years ago was that I wanted to know why, but I didn't need to know why in order to move forward. So, kind of as I continued to evolve and grow and make the commitment to grow, the why started to kind of show up in weird ways, in odd ways. And then I was able to reflect and go, oh, well, that makes more sense. Okay. And that all that was, okay, that's why that is. That's how that showed up. But it wasn't preventing me. I didn't need to know why before I move forward. I think that's the key in all of
Well, you
this.
stop being a victim. You stop being a
Yeah.
victim to the
Yeah.
why. And I think
Yeah.
I remember that shift is that when you really got that the gifts that you learned and the story that you were telling yourself were two different things. And when you
Yeah.
told the truth, and I remember, oh my
You
God,
used to piss me off though. I remember you used to piss me off because I'd go, I just want to know why. And you'd go, you don't need to know. And I'd go, yes, I do. And those were early days in our relationship.
but it
And
stops your growth if you need
oh,
to know why.
you were such a
Totally
bitch.
stops your growth.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Anyway, carry on.
Carry on.
Number 3.
Key number three, everything serves your highest good. This one, I just had this conversation with somebody today, which is they're going through a really tough time in the relationship. And, she's with a right fighter. And, it's a tough place to be. And, in having those conversations, we have to trust, I believe, that we have to trust that whatever we're going through, if we're willing to go through it, if we're willing to go through the eye of the needle, knowing we have to go through it and that we're committed to going through it, it is all and will serve our highest good. And that's hard when you're going through the eye of the needle to believe that. So, the trick here, I think, or the tool here is to reflect really honestly on your past and to think about it. And I've said this many times that you start to discover that even the most challenging times in your life served your highest good. And rather than being pissed off and hanging on to, being bitter, you have to leverage the experiences to become just the best version of yourself. So I think that when we start to recognize that, it when we start to recognize that the present actually shapes the meaning of the past, we can redefine whatever story we have of it. And so when we look at those old stories, rather than saying, I went through this and it was this and this and this, and go, okay, great. This kind of goes back to the gap and the gain. You're telling this story about how painful it was and all the gaps that were back there. Let's talk about all the gains that you had from that story, from all that you went through, and then realize that regardless of what you went through, there was so much in it that is so powerful and works good for you today if you're willing to look at it that way. If you're not, then you're going to continue to be a victim to your past.
Well, the truth is that there's a layer of humility that has to show up in order to admit that you've maybe been wrong. And that level of humility for a right fighter could feel extremely painful because you have to
Hmm.
dismantle what you believe to be true about yourself, and that the fact that you're no longer a victim and that you are in charge and you're 100% responsible for creating the life that you want. I think the hardest part when I'm talking to people similar to the conversation you had today is that the decisions were made thinking somebody might change
Mm.
or somebody
Yeah.
may want to see the light down at the end of the tunnel, or
Yeah.
if I just do this, or if I get married, or if when we have kids, then dot dot dot. I think the
Yeah.
biggest thing is to not beat yourself up for the decisions that you've made that got you here, because to your point, everything that got you here is exactly what you need to have to move forward. And
Yeah.
that's where we get stuck, and I think that's where it's funny, we've been criticized over the years, like, or I have, from a coaching standpoint, is that I I don't actually care about the story.
Mm.
I care about you here right now
Mhm.
and what brought you here, because the pain of staying where you were, for example, is much bigger than the pain of moving forward.
Mhm.
And I think the longer people stay in the pain of knowing that they need to change, and the longer they delay that, the bigger the push on the outside and on the other side. So the sooner you get that you're not your past self and that there is a shift to moving forward, not based on the definition you have of the past or who you needed to be or who you needed that person or that partner to be, the quicker that you're going to move into the life that you want. And is it going to be easy? No. If it was easy, more people would do this work.
Mhm. It's not easy.
No.
Well, you kind of jumped ahead in your conversation because point number 4 was you are not your past self.
Yeah.
So we have to realize that we're not the same person that we were in the past, whether it's 10 years or 10 months or 10 days. So, we have to look at that and realize that we made decisions. I think the whole thing about you're not your past self is that there's lots of times where people, myself included, will beat myself up. We beat ourselves up for decisions we made or things we could have done, should have done if we would have known different, if it would have been this or that. And we spend a lot of time beating ourselves up for who we were back then or the decisions we made, and we should have made better decisions, and we compromised values. I know that's a big one for me, and some of the things that I've done, I feel like, oh god, I just compromised values. But it was interesting, I just did an amazing podcast with a lady that is coming out on the Everyday Millionaire, Sandy, and we had a huge conversation about values, and which was so interesting because here's a lady that's probably, I don't know, probably done $100 million in different businesses or more, uh, so business savvy, and we got into a values conversation, and it was so powerful. But the point was is that we can't hang on to those decisions and beat ourselves up. So part of, I think, and you can have your comment on this, is if we can recognize that we're not our past self, like I say, 10 years, 10 months, 10 days, doesn't matter, we're not our past self, but then can we forgive ourselves? I think that's a really important part of letting go of the past, or that identifying that we're not our story. What's your thoughts?
Well, the hardest part is I see is that we're living into a future right now where we've got this whole freaking Me Too thing where if you've hurt me 10 years ago, 20 years ago, then I'm going to bring it forward. I'm going to charge you with this and charge you with that. And there's not a space right now where people have that space of forgiveness, for a 20-year-old or a 15-year-old or a teenager that made a mistake. Right now, what I'm noticing that's happening is that if we don't have the space of forgiveness of self and other, then it's very easy to pull this victim mentality forward. And that's what scares me as we enter this conversation and make it a little bit deeper is that, yes, you are not your past self. But all you have to do is look on social media and look at people that are being vilified and criminalized for things they did in their past. With all the information they did the best they could in that time. And now 10, 15 years later, I'm looking, oh my gosh, one of my favorite broadcasters, and love him or hate him, Russell Brand is now being vilified for something he did 15 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
knowing, who he was 15 years ago and being very clear. So what worries me is that, yes, number 4, key, you are not your past self. But is that also true for other people that you may have hurt or they perceived you as hurting them? And that's what
Mm-hmm.
is a thing that's moving forward with this whole victim mentality right now in 2023. And I think that we need to take a stand and help people realign and reconnect to themselves to make sure that, I mean, I could do Me Too all day long. I don't know any women that couldn't do a Me Too thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are doing your own work and your own healing, that and you understand that you are not your past self, like, I am not a victim to anything that's happened to me.
Mhm.
past, present, and even future. But that's not a normal conversation. It's much easier to support people to be victims because there's a lot of money to be made, there's a lot of drama. So
Mhm.
number 4 to me is really important, is that you are not your past self. You are not you are not the same person, but other people may want you to be forced into that definition.
Well, and this leads into number 5, which they kind of all go together, don't they? Which is self-awareness can be really, really painful. And, when we start to become aware of how our story starts to frame our life, uh, and we become aware of it. So, in other words, we look at it and we go, "Holy cow!" It can be a pretty painful process, and it can be sometimes cringeworthy. And it starts to reveal how some of your actions have really harmed you and those around you generally, because you're not in it alone. So when we look at the journey of self discovery, it really isn't for the faint of heart. We say that often. It demands some humility and lots of self compassion, and really the willingness to acknowledge our past mistakes. And when we say mistakes, excuse me, when we say mistakes, we're really saying they're lessons that we got. Did we learn them? And can we accept them as lessons so that we don't repeat them? And there is the universe, that there is the I remember my friend told me, he goes, don't worry if you don't hear the universe when it whispers, because it will turn up the volume. And of course, we joke about that because sometimes the last thing you need is the universe to turn up the volume so that you get the lesson. And ultimately, we have to learn these lessons, and sometimes it takes a little bit of work to learn the lessons. And so I think we have to consider the fact that self awareness can be very painful.
It can, and one of the lines that I really love, and it means a lot to me, is that when I know better, I do better. When I know more, I do better.
Mhm.
Because we're all on a journey. And back in the day, maybe I didn't know certain things, or maybe, you weren't raised in a family or in a culture that is allowing of certain things today. But when you know more and you know better, you do better. And
Yeah.
I think if we forget that and we don't embrace curiosity and willingness to get it right rather than fucking be right, you know?
Mhm.
We have to take a look at ourselves and we have to reframe, we have to reshape, we have to understand and give ourselves room and grace to have
Mhm.
messed up and to made mistakes in the past. And unfortunately, we've got people with fine-tooth combs that are going to find what we did and how we screwed up. Honest to God, the world that I'm in the world of sport and performance, if there's people going to look for things and shit that I've done in the past, they're probably going to find it. Maybe I
Mhm.
was mean to somebody or I said something rude or I told someone to fuck off, like, and they were offended by that. Now being offended in the past 10 years ago could create a lawsuit today. So
Mhm.
I just wanna invite people to look at where you're at in these 5 steps, where you're at in, "Oh my gosh, do you believe that everything's happened to you for your highest good?" But here's the other thing, but also for others.
Mhm.
For my highest good and also for yours. And if I make those decisions, then honestly, the rest is up to the universe to decide.
It is. So, as we wind this down, we recap a little bit on these 5 keys, and, we can use them just as guiding lights, if you will, and that we have to recognize that our life really is a story. Our past is a story. And we have to understand, it's helpful to understand that the past doesn't have to define us. And we believe that everything, and we can come to believe that when you look at it through a different lens, everything that's happened up to now actually serves your highest good. And it's good to acknowledge that we aren't our past self, and accepting that self awareness is a journey. It can be at times painful and even cringe-worthy, but we can start to go on that journey of change and being self-aware, and understanding that being a right fighter is not the answer, but considering that rather than be a right fighter, we look to do the right thing, And I think that is, really a way to open up to what it can be. So work to get it right instead of be right. And I think those are five pretty good keys to unlocking our best selves.
Agreed. And I think the biggest thing here is self-awareness leads also to self-forgiveness. And
Hmm.
if you feel like you've screwed up in the past, or there's somebody or something that's blaming you or vilifying you, or linking you to a past self that you are not anymore, just soften, do some work, do some journaling, do whatever it is you need to do to get yourself to your present state, who you are today, and stand for that person. Stand for
Beautiful.
that person.
Fantastic. Stephanie, thank you.
That was fun.